Somewhere on an RV forum this spring, someone asked a question that's been spreading fast. If the new ethanol gas is frying direct injection engines in modern cars, is it doing the same thing to the motor under your motorhome? The honest answer surprised even longtime RV mechanics. The engine bolted to most gas chassis RVs isn't built the way people assume, and that changes where the real danger is actually hiding. That fear didn't come from nowhere. In the spring of 2026, the EPA issued a temporary waiver letting gas stations sell E15, 15% ethanol, through the summer months, a period when it's normally restricted because of smog and evaporation concerns. The stated goal was lower prices at the pump, and consumers could save 10 to 30 cents a gallon. But mechanics who work on small engines for a living were less enthusiastic. One power equipment shop owner, interviewed by a local news crew, put it bluntly: once ethanol starts separating out of the fuel, it basically turns into a sugar-like substance, and that substance eats engines from the inside. His warning was aimed mostly at lawn equipment and older cars. RVers heard it too, and for good reason. A motorhome isn't one engine, it's several. There's the chassis engine that moves the rig down the highway, then there's the generator, and often a chainsaw, a pressure washer, maybe an outboard motor riding along on a trailer. Each one runs on the same pump gas, and each one reacts to ethanol differently. Lumping them together is exactly what makes this confusing for owners trying to figure out what actually applies to their rig. Here's the mechanism underneath all of it. Ethanol is hygroscopic, meaning it pulls water out of the surrounding air, through a vent, through a gap in a fuel cap, through humidity sitting inside a half-empty tank. In an engine running every day, that moisture gets burned off before it accumulates into a problem. In a tank sitting still, it doesn't. Once the water content in ethanol blended fuel reaches roughly 0.5% of total volume, something called phase separation happens. The ethanol and water break away from the gasoline entirely and sink to the bottom of the tank as a separate, corrosive layer. That layer doesn't stay put. It gets drawn into the fuel pump first, ahead of the gasoline sitting above it, so whatever engine is pulling from that tank suddenly gets a slug of water-rich, low-octane liquid instead of proper fuel. For a vehicle driven daily, this is rare. For anything that sits, parked between trips, stored over winter, waiting in a driveway for the next long weekend, it's close to inevitable. And an RV, by design, sits still more than almost any other gas-powered machine on the road. It's worth remembering this isn't a brand new fight either. Ethanol blending in American gasoline dates back to a 1978 Clean Air Act waiver, and the RV world has been quietly adapting to it for nearly as long. This is usually where the story people have already heard comes in. Modern car engines increasingly use gasoline direct injection, spraying fuel straight into the combustion chamber instead of the intake tract upstream of the valves. It's efficient, but it strips away a side effect older engines relied on without anyone really noticing. Fuel no longer washes over the intake valves on its way in, so nothing cleans off the oily residue that collects there. Carbon deposits build, layer by layer, cycle by cycle. Hot spots form on those deposits, and in turbocharged direct injection engines, those hot spots can trigger something called low-speed pre-ignition, where fuel ignites before the spark plug fires and spikes cylinder pressure high enough to crack piston rings or bend a connecting rod. It's a real, well-documented failure mode, and it's the one driving most of the current headlines about ethanol wrecking modern engines. If you've seen that story and immediately worried about your RV, that's a reasonable jump to make. It's also, for most RV chassis engines, the wrong worry entirely. Check the engine actually bolted to most Class A and Class C gas chassis, and the picture looks different. The Ford F-53, which underpins a large share of the gas motorhome market, ran on Ford's Triton V10 for decades, and more recently carries the 7.3-liter V8, nicknamed Godzilla. Neither one uses direct injection. Both use conventional port fuel injection, spraying fuel into the intake port rather than directly into the combustion chamber. Ford engineers made that choice deliberately when they designed the Godzilla engine, prioritizing long-term reliability and ease of service over the small efficiency gain direct injection offers elsewhere in the lineup. One side effect, intentional or not, is that port injection keeps a constant wash of fuel and detergent flowing over the intake valves, which is exactly the cleaning action direct injection engines lost. The carbon buildup and low-speed pre-ignition problem driving so much of the current ethanol panic largely doesn't apply here, because the fuel delivery architecture that creates the problem isn't present in the engine at all. That's not a reason to stop paying attention to ethanol. It's a reason to stop worrying about the wrong failure mode and start looking at the ones that actually matter for a motorhome. Ford's own chassis manual for the F53, the one bolted to the frame, and not the glossy brochure printed by the coach builder, spells out the fuel it expects: unleaded gasoline or unleaded blended with up to 15% ethanol at a minimum 87 octane. That's E15, the exact blend behind this year's headlines, and Ford has approved it for this chassis for years. Checking the chassis manual specifically, not the RV manufacturer's version, comes up constantly in owner communities because the two documents don't always agree, and the chassis builder's numbers are the ones that actually govern the engine. None of this is new tension either. Back in 2011, after the EPA first cleared E15 for cars built in 2001 or later, a congressional subcommittee sent letters to 14 automakers asking about the relationship between E15 and their warranties. All 14 wrote back with concerns, and several flagged the potential for engine damage in vehicles outside the specific model years the waiver covered. Ford's chassis engineering answered that concern directly for its own product. Fuel system materials matter here too. On rubber lines and carburetor gaskets specifically, most documentation points to 1981 and newer components holding up fine against ethanol blends, though nobody has run a dedicated long-term study on RV fuel systems specifically, which is part of why the advice tends to stay conservative. The highway engine on most RVs was built around exactly the fuel now expanding at the pump. That still leaves the rest of the rig. The generator is a different machine entirely, living a different life. Most RV generators run far fewer hours per year than the chassis engine, sitting idle in a compartment for weeks between uses, sometimes months if the rig is a seasonal one. Owners who've reached out to Cummins about their own generators report being told not to run anything richer than E10 through them, a tighter limit than the chassis engine carries. The storage habits that keep a generator healthy are specific: exercising it under load roughly once a month, even during the off-season, so fuel keeps moving and moisture doesn't get the chance to settle and separate. Skip that, and the same phase separation process building in a parked chassis tank happens faster in the smaller fuel system, feeding the generator, where there's less total volume to dilute the water layer once it forms. In humid climates, there's a second cost. Moisture pulled through a stagnant fuel system can corrode the generator's slip rings, wearing down the brushes that carry current out of the unit, an electrical failure with a fuel chemistry root cause rather than a wiring one. It's an easy detail to miss, because when that generator finally sputters and dies in a campground with no shore power, the symptom looks electrical, and the actual cause, sitting quietly in the fuel bowl for 3 months, never gets a second look. Then there's everything else riding along: chainsaws, pressure washers, portable generators, and especially outboard motors on any boat an RV owner is hauling, run smaller, often carbureted fuel systems with a fraction of the tolerance built into a modern chassis engine. Mercury, testing its own outboards on E15, found the higher blend caused serious damage and now recommends ethanol-free fuel exclusively for its engines. A technical trainer at Bosch gives similar advice for any small engine headed into storage. If E15 is what's in the tank, drain it and refill with E10 before parking it, because the higher blend degrades faster and leaves more residue behind during the exact idle stretch when residue does the most damage. E15 compatibility guidance published for RV owners draws the same line consistently. Safe for most cars built after 2000, unsafe for boats, ATVs, lawn equipment, and anything built before 2001. None of this is about one bad tank causing a rough start. It's cumulative. a small amount of moisture and residue added with every fill, building quietly until the accumulated damage finally shows up as a machine that won't turn over at the start of the season. Put those three pieces together and the actual risk profile for an RV looks almost inverted from what the headlines suggest. The chassis engine, built with old-fashioned port injection and rated for E15 by its own manufacturer, is arguably better positioned for today's fuel than the direct injection engine in a daily driver sedan parked in the next campsite. The generator and the small engines on board, built with tighter ethanol tolerances and far worse resistance to sitting still, are the actual weak point. And the RV lifestyle itself, built around exactly the kind of long, idle stretch that lets phase separation happen, is what turns an ordinary fuel blend into a maintenance problem instead of a background fact of life. Weekend warriors who put a few hundred miles on the chassis every month rarely see any of this. Owners whose rigs sit in storage from October through April are the ones who open the compartment door in spring and find out the hard way. The danger was never really about direct injection. It was about how long the fuel sits before anything burns it. A few habits close most of that gap. Check the chassis manual, not the coach manual, for the actual ethanol limit on the engine driving the rig. For most Ford F53 gas chassis, E15 is within spec, so that particular worry can be set down entirely. Run the generator under load at least once a month, storage season included, so fuel keeps moving through it instead of sitting still and separating. For anything with a small carbureted engine, outboards, chainsaws, pressure washers, favor ethanol-free fuel where it's sold, or drain the tank before a long stretch of storage rather than leaving E15 to sit and separate inside it. When a rig goes into storage for more than a few weeks, treat the fuel with a stabilizer and, where possible, keep the tank fuller rather than emptier, since less airspace leaves less room for moisture to collect and condense over time. None of these habits are complicated. They're the same maintenance instincts RV owners have leaned on for decades, just aimed at the specific failure mode ethanol actually causes here, instead of the one borrowed from a completely different kind of engine built for a completely different kind of driving. The story of ethanol in RV fuel isn't a story of good versus evil, and it isn't the same story playing out under the hood of a turbocharged sedan. It's a story about which parts of a motorhome run every week and which parts sit for months, and about a fuel chemistry that only turns dangerous once something stops moving. Know which engine on your rig is actually built for that fuel, and which ones are just waiting quietly for their next long weekend to arrive. If your rig runs a Ford F53 chassis, the real fuel risk isn't where you'd think. Subscribe for more.